My name is Harper Lane. I was 16 the night I realized silence could cut deeper than any blow. The basement smelled like detergent and cold concrete, the kind of smell that clings to your skin long after you leave. A laundry basket was in my hands when Daniel walked down the stairs. His boots were still on damp from the yard. He didn't speak. He never needed to. The look he gave me was enough to freeze the air around us. Then the kick came. Precise. Sharp. It landed on my right side, and I heard the sound before I felt it. A clean, splitting crack that carved its way through the quiet. The basket crashed to the floor. Socks scattered. My breath stopped halfway in my chest, trapped behind pain that burned like fire. My knees buckled. The concrete was hard against my palms. Daniel stood over me with the calm that only cruelty knows. He bent down slightly close enough for me to smell the leather of his boots. His voice slid through the space between us. "Get up, or I'll make it worse." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I tried to breathe. Each inhale stabbed. Black dots flickered at the edge of my sight. My cheek pressed against the floor. Upstairs, the laundry machine hummed steady and indifferent. It was the 12th time that year. 12 times he had done this. 12 times my mother had watched. I heard her footsteps. They were quick but hesitant. She appeared on the stairs like a ghost, pale and trembling. Her hands hovered near her chest. Her eyes bounced between us, trapped in a loop she would never break. "Just say it was the stairs," she whispered. Her voice shook. Daniel didn't even look at her. He turned his back and walked toward the washer like nothing had happened. My mother knelt beside me. Her hands were cold when they touched my shoulder. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. This house had its own rules. Pain lived here like a quiet tenant. No one said its name. My breath came in short gasps. The shape of my ribs beneath my shirt felt wrong. I stared at the narrow mirror on the wall. My face was chalk white, my lips pale, my reflection a stranger, 16 and already learning how to disappear. Daniel's voice drifted from the kitchen. He was asking for a beer. My mother flinched like she'd been struck. Her whisper broke into the air again. "Harper, get up, please." I pushed myself upright with one elbow. Pain burned down my side like a hot wire, but I stood anyway, because if I didn't, he would come back. She cried silently as I passed her on the stairs. She didn't touch me. She didn't stop me. The hallway mirror caught my reflection again at the top. A bruised girl with tired eyes stared back. 16. A girl who learned that pain had a schedule. It came monthly like bills. Predictable. Reliable. I pressed my hand against my ribs. Something uneven rose beneath my palm. I had learned to hide bruises. I had learned to lie to teachers, to neighbors, to everyone. But looking at myself in that mirror, I understood something else. This house would not save me. Not my mother. Not anyone. I was fluent in silence, but silence was slowly killing me. Upstairs, the television turned on. Daniel laughed easy and warm, the sound of a man who believed he'd never be caught. I closed my eyes and took a shallow breath. One day, I thought, one day the silence would end. I didn't know yet that it would be a machine that spoke for me. I didn't know that X-rays would expose what my voice could not. But in that hallway, under the warm ceiling light, I made a promise. I would not disappear quietly. If you have ever had to scream silently, comment, "I see you." Someone out there needs to know they are not alone. When people saw Daniel for the first time, they said things like dependable or kind. He had the sort of face that put people at ease. He was tall, always well-groomed, the kind of man neighbors trusted without a second thought. My mom met him at a church fundraiser 2 years after my dad's accident. I was 11, then too young to notice how grief softens people to anyone who seems steady. My dad had been killed in a car crash on a rainy highway in the fall, and ever since that night, silence filled every corner of our house. Daniel stepped into that silence like a man who knew exactly what to say. He brought flowers, took off his hat when he entered a room, and looked my mom in the eye when he talked. He told stories about his construction work, about how he admired strong families, about how he wanted to build something stable. People loved him. I wanted to love him too because he made my mom smile again. When she married him a year later, the house felt almost warm for a moment. That warmth didn't last. The first thing Daniel changed was our schedule. He liked routines, he said. Bedtime was 9 sharp, phone off by 8, homework done in silence. He took my mom's phone and mine to install a parental monitoring app, told us it was about safety. He smiled as he said it. My mom nodded like it made sense. I didn't like it, but I was just a kid, and kids don't get to vote. Then came the rules about friends. No visitors during the week, no sleepovers. He told my mom that teenagers needed discipline, that letting me drift would ruin my future. The way he said my name during those conversations always made my stomach twist. Over time, the house got quieter. Friends stopped asking me to hang out because I always said no. I told them Daniel was strict, but what I really meant was Daniel liked control. He liked hearing his footsteps echo in an obedient house. When I was 14, something small changed everything. I walked in one afternoon from school, my backpack still on one shoulder. He was in the kitchen reading the paper like some black and white photograph of a perfect father. I mumbled a soft hi and tried to pass him. That's when it happened. His hand caught my arm, not hard but sharp enough to make me freeze. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Try that again." I didn't understand at first. Then I realized I hadn't greeted him properly. I said hi again louder this time. His expression didn't change, but the next moment pain bloomed across my shoulder as he shoved me back against the counter. Not hard enough to leave a mark that anyone would question, just hard enough to let me know the new rules. He leaned close, his breath steady. "When you walk in this house, you greet me with respect." It was the first time he'd touched me like that. The first time I felt the air in the house shift. My mom came in from the laundry room moments later. She saw me frozen near the counter, saw him standing there, and her smile faltered, but didn't break. She asked if everything was okay. He laughed, said I'd just tripped. She believed him or pretended to. After that day, little incidents piled up like bricks. A raised voice over a misplaced cup. A sudden grip on my wrist because I didn't answer fast enough. A shove when I talked back. All quiet, all hidden. There were no bruises that would show under school clothes. No broken bones yet. Just a steady tightening of his grip around the house. Mom started deflecting questions. If I showed up at school with a limp, she told teachers I was clumsy. If neighbors asked about the shouting, she laughed and said teenagers are dramatic. I learned to keep my voice low and my steps quieter. He liked it when the house felt small and silent. At 15, the bruises started to hurt longer. He always knew where to hit, where to shove, where to make it ache, but not show. It was like he had practiced. He controlled everything by then: the Wi-Fi, the groceries, the money, the keys. My mom stopped going out with friends. I stopped having friends. The walls of the house became its own country ruled by Daniel's temper. I remember sitting at the back of the classroom and wondering if anyone could tell. Could they see the stiffness in how I sat, the way I flinched when someone moved too fast near me? No one asked. Not really. Everyone thought we were fine because he wore clean shirts and she wore a practiced smile. He shook hands at church. He waved to neighbors. They called him solid, dependable. My mother kept repeating the same lines every time something happened. She fell down the stairs. "She's just clumsy." She walked into a door. "She's not used to the new floors." Each lie became smoother than the one before it. I began to memorize them too, because the fastest way to make him stop was to agree. Somewhere along the way, my house stopped feeling like a place where I lived. It became a stage where we rehearsed the same script again and again. He would hurt, she would deny, I would pretend, and no one outside those walls ever saw a single thing. Control didn't fall over us all at once. It crept in slowly like fog seeping under a door, filling every room until you could hardly breathe without permission. At first, Daniel said it was about responsibility. He said teenagers needed structure, that my generation wasted too much time on screens. Every night at 8, he unplugged the Wi-Fi router. He locked it in the hall closet like it was some dangerous weapon. He took my phone after dinner, saying good kids didn't need distractions. When I complained, he smiled, not cruelly at first, but with that slow patience that made me feel like I was the problem. Then came the curfews. No more hanging out after school. No visiting friends on weekends. No extracurricular activities unless he approved them. The house became my entire world, and Daniel controlled every inch of it. When friends texted, I couldn't reply until the next morning. Eventually, they stopped asking me to come over, stopped inviting me anywhere. Their lives moved on while mine shrank into the walls of our house. The bruises came more often by then. Not all of them from kicks or shoves. Some were just from the way fear made me tense and stumble. I learned to wear long hoodies, oversized sweaters, anything to cover the evidence. Even in summer when the Kentucky heat stuck to your skin like glue, I pulled those sleeves down and kept my collarbones hidden. No one asked why. Teenagers wear hoodies all the time. It's easy to disappear when everyone assumes normal. When I walked down the school hallway, I could feel them seeing a quiet girl who kept to herself. They didn't see the girl who memorized the sound of boots on basement stairs. They didn't see the bruises blooming in hidden places. Sometimes at night, the neighbors must have heard something. I know they did. Our houses were close together and walls aren't thick enough to smother the sound of shouting. Once, Mrs. Carter from next door came by the next day with a casserole. She asked in that soft, careful voice if everything was okay. Daniel laughed warm and easy and told her I had tripped again. He was always good at that part, good at playing the part of a tired stepfather raising a clumsy teenage girl. He said it like it was a punchline, and Mrs. Carter laughed along because people want to believe what's comfortable. Nobody wants to look straight at something ugly if they can help it. After that, she never asked again. Mom got quieter, too. There was a time she used to sing while cooking dinner off-key and soft. That stopped. She started keeping her eyes down whenever Daniel walked into the room. I noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she passed him a plate, how she waited for his reaction like every gesture was a test she might fail. I started seeing the truth. She wasn't on his side, not really. She was trapped too. But that didn't make it easier to forgive her. Her silence cut deeper than his orders. At least with him I knew what to expect. With her, it was the slow, cold ache of betrayal. I would catch her watching me sometimes when he wasn't looking. Her face was full of things she would never say. Fear, regret, maybe even guilt. But the words never came. She let his rules swallow both of us. There were nights when the house felt too quiet. That was when I hated it most. The quiet meant nothing had happened yet, but it would. I could feel it in the air like static before a storm. I'd lie awake in my room listening to the house breathe, counting the creaks in the floorboards as Daniel moved around downstairs. If I heard the TV, I knew I had a little more time. If it went silent, my heartbeat jumped to the back of my throat. Mom stayed in the bedroom after 10 every night, pretending to sleep, waiting for the morning. I don't think she ever really slept. I didn't either. I started pulling my sleeves down to my wrists out of habit, even when no one was around. That's how control works. You start policing yourself so they don't have to. I stopped looking in mirrors because my own reflection began to look like someone I didn't want to know. My eyes were tired, my posture small. I barely recognized myself. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a container with rules etched into the walls. Don't talk too loud. Don't ask to leave. Don't let anyone see. When he smiled in front of other people, I almost wanted to scream because they believed it. They believed the good stepfather act, the hard worker who cared about his family. But behind closed doors, his control was meticulous. No TV after 9. No doors locked in the house. No visitors without permission. Every rule chipped a little more away from the person I used to be. Mom became a shadow existing in the space between his moods. She flinched when his car pulled into the driveway. She froze when his keys jingled at the door. She wasn't my protector anymore. She was surviving next to me, but at least I had no illusions left. I understood that whatever happened, it was me against him, and her silence was part of the cage. Some nights I sat by my window staring at the streetlights and wondering what it would feel like to walk out and keep going. I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have anyone left to call. My world was this house, its walls pressing in closer with every breath. The cage didn't need bars. It had rules, fear, and silence. And somehow, that was enough to keep me locked in. It happened on a night that smelled like rain. March in Kentucky has that wet chill that creeps through the windows no matter how tightly they're shut. The television was on in the living room, humming softly, and my mom was in the kitchen rinsing dishes. I was standing at the table with a glass of water in my hand. It slipped. It wasn't a big crash, just a soft clatter against the wood and a splash across the table. But the sound was enough. His footsteps came down the hall before the glass even stopped rolling. Daniel hated messes, hated anything that reminded him he wasn't in complete control. He didn't ask what happened. He never did. His eyes found me like a scope locking onto a target. I could feel the air pull tight between us. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He moved in one smooth step, his boot swinging with practiced aim. The impact landed on the right side of my ribs, sharp and merciless. For a split second there was nothing. No pain, no breath, just the sound. A clean, unmistakable crack. I crumpled like paper, my knees smacking the floor. The sound of the rain outside faded, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat colliding with silence. Pain came a second later, hot and white, blooming out from my ribs like fire spreading under my skin. I tried to inhale, but my lungs refused to cooperate. My mouth opened, but air felt like glass scraping against the inside of my chest. I curled forward instinctively, arms around myself, trying to hold everything together. He stood over me, hands in his pockets, like this was just another night, like I was nothing more than a thing that had fallen out of place. "Get up," he said, his voice low, almost bored. "Get up." He repeated it like a command drilled into me, but I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. The pain was too much. Every second on the floor felt like my ribs were splitting further apart. My vision blurred at the edges, the ceiling tilting sideways. I tasted blood before I saw it, metallic and thick, seeping from the corner of my mouth. My hands pressed against the floor. It felt far away. The room spun. That was when my mom appeared. She came around the corner, dish towel in one hand, face pale as bone. She saw me on the floor. She saw him standing over me. And just like every other time, she didn't scream. She didn't run to the phone. She just froze, caught between the man she feared and the daughter she was supposed to protect. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the towel. Her lips parted, but nothing came out at first. Then she whispered it, the same line I'd heard so many times it might as well have been carved into the walls. "It's the stairs, Harper." She crouched down, her hands hovering near my arm, but not touching me yet. I could hear the panic in her breath, short and shaky. "It's the stairs, Harper." The script was already written. My ribs screamed with each shallow breath. I coughed again, and red stained the back of my hand. I watched her eyes widen at the sight, but she didn't move to do anything different. She just kept whispering the lie. Daniel stepped away like he was bored with the whole scene. He grabbed a beer from the fridge. The sound of the bottle cap twisting open made me want to scream. How easy it was for him to hurt me and walk away. How normal it had become. My mom slid her hands under my arm, trying to help me up. Her touch was careful, like she didn't want to make it worse, but she also didn't want to make it real. I leaned against her, my breath hitching with every movement. I saw her face up close. The fear there wasn't just for me. It was for herself, too. She was trapped just like me, but that didn't make me feel better. It made me feel alone. Utterly, completely alone. I staggered to my feet. The room tilted. Pain carved itself into every inch of my chest. I pressed my hand against my ribs and felt the uneven rise beneath the skin. I had felt bruises before. I had felt pain before, but this was different. This was something broken. He walked past me as if I were a piece of furniture. He didn't look back. He just settled into his chair in front of the television, the glow of the screen washing over his face, making him look even colder. My mom kept her eyes on the floor. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't have to. We both knew the answer. She whispered again, almost like a prayer. "It's the stairs." That was the moment something inside me shifted. I realized that if I didn't act, if I kept swallowing his cruelty and her silence, I wasn't going to make it to 17. My ribs throbbed beneath my palm. My breath shook like the air itself was unstable. The world narrowed to the sound of the television, the rain, and the steady hum of pain. He would keep doing this. She would keep lying, and one day I would stop getting up. That thought rooted itself deep heavier than the pain. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a quiet, sharp understanding that something had to break and it couldn't be me again. Not this time. The morning came slow and heavy, like the house itself didn't want to let go of the night before. My ribs burned with every shallow breath. When I tried to sit up, the pain sliced through me like a knife under my skin. Mom hovered in the doorway of my room, still in her pajama pants, holding her phone in one hand like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight into a thin line. Daniel had already left for work. I could hear the truck rumble fade down the street earlier. That was the only reason she dared to speak. "We need to get that checked," she whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. I nodded once because nodding was easier than breathing. She moved around like a ghost getting her keys, purse, insurance card. Neither of us spoke while she helped me into the car. I pressed my palm lightly to my ribs, the pressure doing nothing against the sharp ache. The drive to Baptist Health Lexington felt longer than it should have. The March sky was gray, and the air outside the window was wet from rain that hadn't fully stopped. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. I stared straight ahead, focusing on the power lines passing by, counting them like steps away from the basement floor. Inside the emergency room, the fluorescent lights were too bright. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee. Mom signed the paperwork at the front desk, her voice flat, rehearsed. She told the receptionist my daughter fell down the stairs last night. She said it like it was the weather, like it was just another fact of the world. The woman at the desk nodded and handed her a clipboard. That was the script. That had always been the script. A nurse called my name. Kelly. Her name tag was pinned straight and neat on her scrub top. She was middle-aged with gray hair pulled back tight, and she had the kind of eyes that didn't miss anything. When she led me into the exam room, she asked my mom to sit down, but the way she looked at her said she didn't have to. She turned to me, her voice soft but steady. "What happened, sweetheart?" My mom jumped in before I could open my mouth. She fell down the stairs. "It's happened before." Kelly didn't look at her. She didn't even blink. She kept her eyes on me like she was reading something beneath my skin. Her hands moved gently as she checked my vitals. When she touched the side of my ribs, I flinched before I could stop myself. She paused for just a second. Then she said the words that would end the silence I had been living in for years. "These aren't from stairs, sweetheart." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room fell very still. My mom froze on the chair. Her hands twisted in her lap. Kelly's voice didn't carry judgment. It carried something heavier. Certainty. She didn't ask permission when she told us she was calling radiology for x-rays. It wasn't a suggestion. I followed her to another room. The hall smelled like bleach, the walls too white, the lights too harsh. The technician was quiet as he positioned me against the machine, telling me to hold still, breathe shallowly. The machine clicked and hummed, its cold, mechanical eyes staring straight through me. For the first time, it felt like someone could see what I couldn't say. The technician didn't speak, but his eyes flicked to the monitor for half a second. Something in that flicker told me everything. Back in the exam room, I sat on the edge of the paper-covered table. My legs dangled above the floor. Mom kept pacing, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't look at anything. Kelly came back first, then the doctor. He was tall, with glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. He clipped the x-rays onto the light board, and the room shifted. There they were, my bones glowing pale and fragile against black. One line was bright and sharp, fresh. But what stole the air from the room were the others. Fainter lines. Old breaks. 7 in total in different stages of healing. The doctor traced them with his finger one by one, his voice clinical but heavy. "This one's recent. And here, and here older fractures, some several months old." My mom's hand flew to her mouth. Her knees trembled as she sat down. I stared at the images. It was like looking at a confession I hadn't written. The truth was there, undeniable, carved into my bones. Every moment he had hurt me. Every time I had kept quiet. Every lie we had told. They were all right there. Kelly stood by the door, her arms crossed, eyes on my mother. "Mrs. Rhodes, These injuries are not consistent with falling down the stairs." The words hit harder than any kick. Mom tried to speak, but the sound that came out was a whisper. "She's clumsy. It's not what it looks like." Her voice broke halfway through the sentence, like even she didn't believe it anymore. The doctor turned to Kelly. She didn't wait for him to say anything. She picked up the phone on the wall. Her voice was calm, practiced like she had done this before. "This is Nurse Kelly in emergency. We need CPS and law enforcement notified immediately." The blood in my veins went cold. I stared at her, then at the glowing x-rays on the wall. My secrets were no longer mine. For years, I'd lived with this pain locked inside me. But machines don't lie. They don't care about the stories families tell. My mom's hands were shaking violently now. She tried to reach for me but stopped halfway, fingers curling in on themselves. I couldn't read her face. Was it guilt? Fear? Both. She whispered my name, once barely audible. "Harper." But I didn't answer. For the first time, she wasn't the one deciding what happened next. A social worker arrived a few minutes later. She wore a navy blazer and had a small folder tucked under her arm. She knelt down in front of me so she was at eye level. Her voice was gentle but steady, like someone who carried the weight of other people's truths for a living. "Harper, my name is Ms. Martinez. We're going to make sure you're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign, like something that belonged to other people. Daniel had never allowed words like that in our house. Kelly stood behind her like a guard, arms still folded. The doctor was quietly documenting everything. My mom sat motionless in the corner, her shoulders shaking silently. She looked so small then, like the silence she had clung to all those years had finally turned on her. For once, I wasn't the only one who couldn't breathe. They asked questions, simple ones. How long? How often? When did it start? I answered in fragments. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up years ago. Ms. Martinez nodded each time, like every word I spoke was something she already knew but needed me to say out loud. Kelly handed her the chart with my injuries. 7 old fractures. 1 fresh. A pattern too obvious to ignore. "The police were already on their way," she said softly. My mom jerked her head up at that. "No, wait, please," she whispered, but her voice was paper thin. Kelly didn't flinch. The silence was no longer hers to protect. "They asked if I wanted to stay in the hospital overnight for observation. I said yes, not because I wanted to, but because the idea of going home made the pain worse." Kelly gave me a small nod, the kind that says without words that someone sees you. The doctor turned off the light box, but the images of my broken ribs were burned into my brain. I would never unsee them. Machines don't lie. They never had. I looked at my mom one more time. She didn't look back. I think she was still trying to figure out where everything had gone wrong. Maybe she already knew. I sat in that cold room with the paper crinkling beneath me, realizing this was the moment everything cracked open. The house, the lies, the silence. It was all unraveling. And for the first time, the truth was louder than him. If you believe the truth always finds a way, tap that like button. They moved me from the exam room to a private room at the far end of the pediatric ward, a small space with pale walls and a window that faced the parking lot. The bed had clean white sheets that smelled faintly of bleach. It was quiet except for the hum of a machine monitoring my oxygen levels. For the first time in years, I was in a room where Daniel couldn't walk in unannounced, where his boots wouldn't echo against the floor. Kelly checked on me once before leaving. She squeezed my hand gently the way you do with someone standing at the edge of something enormous and whispered that the detective would arrive soon. I stared at the IV pole beside the bed, tracing the metal with my eyes, 'cause it was easier than looking at my mom. She sat in the chair in the corner of the room staring at her trembling hands. She hadn't said a word since CPS arrived. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her shoulders hunched forward, her lips moving soundlessly. The door opened after a while and 2 people walked in. One was Detective Carla Jones from CID, the other a local uniformed officer. Carla was in her late 40s, tall with dark hair pulled back and a badge clipped neatly at her waist. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many stories like mine. "Harper, I'm Detective Jones," she said as she sat down near the foot of the bed. "I'm here to listen. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, but if you want to talk, I'll hear everything." The officer stood near the door, quiet but watchful. Ms. Martinez, the social worker, slipped in behind them and sat closer to me than anyone else, not touching, just being there. I hesitated at first. My hands twisted the edge of the hospital blanket. I could still hear Daniel's voice in my head, telling me to keep quiet, telling me no one would believe me. But the machine next to me beeped softly, reminding me of what had already been revealed. They had seen the X-rays. The silence didn't protect him anymore. I started talking. At first, the words came in fragments, but they didn't stop. I told them about the glass of water, the kick the sound my ribs made. I told them about the nights of no Wi-Fi, no friends, no freedom. I told them about the first shove at 14, about the look on his face when he hurt me, about my mother whispering, "It's the stairs," Harper, like it was a prayer. Detective Jones didn't interrupt. She didn't take her eyes off me. Her voice only entered the room when she asked something specific. How often? How long? Where? She wrote everything down carefully, her pen steady like each word I spoke mattered. Ms. Martinez nodded softly, with each detail grounding me in the present, as I pulled pieces of the past into the light. When I finished, my throat felt raw, like I had been holding those words behind my teeth for too long. The detective closed her notebook. "Thank you, Harper. You did everything right." She stood and turned to my mom, who still sat frozen in the chair. "Mrs. Rhodes, I have some questions for you as well." My mom's head snapped up, her face drained of what little color it had left. She stammered, trying to find something to hold on to. I thought, he..." Detective Jones didn't let her finish. "Ma'am, the injuries on your daughter's X-rays show a pattern of long-term abuse. We have reasonable cause to believe you were aware of at least some of it." Her voice wasn't cruel. It was factual, solid, the kind of voice that doesn't need to prove itself. Mom pressed her shaking hands together. Tears slid down her face, but the detective didn't look away. "Silence isn't protection, Mrs. Rhodes. It's complicity." My mom's breath hitched. She looked at me, then really looked at me for the first time in a long time, but I couldn't give her anything back. I had nothing left to give her. While she answered the detective's questions, I stared at the window. The parking lot below was nearly empty except for a few cars under the gray Kentucky sky. My phone buzzed weakly on the tray next to me. Daniel had called 5 times already. His name flashing across the screen felt like a ghost pressing its face against the glass. The officer silenced the phone and bagged it as evidence. "We've got what we need," he muttered. They moved fast after that. Carla made a few calls. Her voice sharpened efficient a tone that said the wheels were already turning. Daniel was at work when the officers showed up at the house. They didn't tell me every detail, but I heard enough. He tried to charm them at first the same way he'd charmed neighbors for years. But charm doesn't work when the evidence is carved into someone's bones. 2 hours after I'd told my story, he was in handcuffs. The officer who brought the news in leaned against the doorway. He didn't smile, but his voice carried the weight of something settled. "He's in custody. No bail yet." My mom's hands flew to her mouth. A soft sound came out somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She folded into herself, shoulders shaking silently. I lay back against the pillow, my chest aching with every shallow breath, but for the first time in so long, I didn't feel like I was holding something up alone. The silence was no longer mine to carry. A nurse came in to adjust my IV. Her gentle hands grounded me to the room, to the hospital, to a place that didn't belong to him. Outside, the sky darkened into early evening, the kind that sits low and heavy before a storm. Detective Jones returned after a while. She told me they'd collected evidence from the house photographs of the bruises, medical reports, statements from neighbors. The neighbors. Apparently, someone down the street admitted they'd heard things over the years, but hadn't known what to do. I stared at the window as she spoke, watching a single raindrop trace its way down the glass. All those nights of feeling alone, of thinking no one saw and people had heard. They'd just chosen silence, too. The detective didn't sugarcoat anything. This would be a long process. There would be interviews, statements, court appearances. but she also said something I'd never heard anyone say to me before. "Harper, you're safe now." It was a simple sentence, and maybe she said it to hundreds of kids, but it cracked something open in me. Safe. The word was foreign fragile. My mom remained quiet, answering only when the detective asked her direct questions. The look in her eyes was something between shame and grief. I wondered if she was finally understanding what her silence had done. The hospital hallway outside my room grew quieter as night settled in. The hum of machines was steady, a strange kind of comfort. I looked out the window again. The parking lot lights had flicked on, scattering halos across the wet pavement. For the first time, I let myself feel the truth of it. Daniel wasn't coming through that door. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. The house that had been my cage was being combed through by people who weren't afraid of him. The neighbors were whispering. I could imagine how fast the news would travel. In towns like ours, stories move faster than the wind. I pictured the same people who'd smiled at him, who'd waved on their porches, now shaking their heads behind drawn curtains. They'd say they never knew, but I wondered how many had suspected and chosen not to see. It didn't matter anymore. The silence had broken wide open, and once it breaks, it can't be put back together. I leaned my head back against the pillow, the soft beeping of the monitor filling the room. I had lost everything I'd known, but none of it had ever really been mine. What I had now was something different, a small, fragile piece of freedom. It didn't feel warm or triumphant. It felt quiet. Steady. I wasn't healed. I wasn't safe forever. But in that moment, staring through the hospital window at the rain-soaked parking lot, I knew something had shifted forever. He was gone. The story wasn't over, but the cage was cracked wide open, and I could breathe. Not fully, not without pain, but I could breathe. The next morning, the hospital room felt different. It wasn't quieter exactly. It was the kind of silence that comes after something explodes. The machines still hummed, the hallway still buzzed faintly with nurses doing their rounds, but everything had a strange clarity to it. My ribs hurt less when I breathed, not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time in years, the weight sitting on top of it wasn't Daniel's shadow. Ms. Martinez walked into the room, holding a newspaper folded under her arm. She didn't say anything at first. She just handed it to me and stepped back, giving me space. The front page headline was bold, sharp, impossible to miss. Stepfather arrested for felony child abuse, hospital x-rays, reveal pattern. Below it was a grainy photo of our house. The porch light glared like an eye. Someone had taken the picture after the police arrived the night before. The article described the investigation in simple, careful language. It talked about how medical staff at Baptist Health Lexington had identified multiple historical fractures. It talked about CPS involvement, about the arrest, about the pending charges. It didn't have my name, but it didn't need to. In a town like ours, everyone would know exactly who they were talking about. My hands trembled as I read it. Not from fear, but from something stranger. Something that felt like standing outside on the first cold morning of winter when the air bites your lungs but reminds you that you're still alive. Daniel was no longer just a man who hid behind our front door. He was a headline. He was someone other people now had to look at. The door opened again, and Nurse Kelly poked her head in, smiling gently. "Did you see it yet, sweetheart?" I nodded. She walked in fully this time, her sneakers quiet against the tile. "We're doing a small press briefing today," she said, "about the role of medical screenings in exposing abuse cases. You don't have to be part of it." I knew she was trying to give me control, to remind me I had choices now. I didn't need to stand in front of cameras. But just hearing that they were talking about it publicly felt like oxygen. The secret wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't something buried in the walls of our house. It was out there in ink and light and whispers. Later that day, I heard the voices echoing from the hallway. Reporters asking questions, hospital staff answering carefully. I caught fragments through the half-open door. Pattern of old injuries. Early detection saves lives. Mandatory reporting saves children. Each word carried its own weight. My ribs throbbed beneath the bandages, but I couldn't look away from the moment. It was happening without me, and yet because of me. I sat on the bed with the paper still in my lap, tracing the headline with my fingertip. Mom sat in the corner, her body folded in on itself. She hadn't spoken much since the night of the arrest. Her hands twisted the hem of her sweater over and over. When the news segment came on the small hospital TV mounted on the wall, she finally looked up. The anchor's voice was clean and steady. A Fayette County man has been charged with felony child abuse after hospital x-rays revealed a pattern of long-term injuries on a 16-year-old girl. My chest tightened at the sound of those words. Not out of fear anymore, but because they were finally being said aloud by someone who wasn't me. Someone who couldn't be ignored. Then they showed the footage, the house, the flashing police lights, Daniel being led away in handcuffs. His head was slightly down, that mask of calm stripped away. For years, I'd watched him walk through that front door like a king. Now, I watched him walk out of it like a criminal. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But what came instead was a quiet stillness spreading through me like light. All those years of secrets, and now the world knew. My mom made a small sound, not quite a sob, not quite a sigh. Her hand covered her mouth. Her eyes darted between the screen and me. I could see shame settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat, but beneath it was something else too. Relief. For the first time, the lie she'd clung to wasn't hers to carry alone. The truth had blown it wide open. I turned my gaze back to the TV. The image burned into me. I wasn't his shadow anymore. I wasn't a secret bruised girl at the back of the classroom. The neighbors knew now. My classmates would know by lunch. My teachers would know by tomorrow morning. The town would talk. But this time, their whispers couldn't cage me. A few hours later, my phone, now under police monitoring, buzzed with messages from classmates. Some were shocked. Some said they were sorry. A few admitted they'd suspected something was wrong. Reading their words didn't make me feel vindicated or angry. It just confirmed what I already knew. People had seen cracks in the mask, but chose comfort over confrontation. They saw bruises under hoodies, flinches in the hallway, the way I avoided eye contact, and they said nothing. I couldn't change that, but they couldn't pretend anymore either. Detective Carla came to check on me in the afternoon. She stood at the foot of the bed, hands tucked in her jacket pockets. "It's moving fast," she said. "The DA's already involved. They're preparing the case. Daniel's in county lockup. No bail set yet." Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't celebrating. She was just telling me the truth. I liked that about her. She treated me like a witness, not a child too fragile to handle reality. Mom shifted uncomfortably in the corner. Carla turned to her briefly. "We'll need to speak again, Mrs. Rhodes. I'll set up a time for a formal interview." Mom nodded weakly, her eyes red from silent tears. She looked like someone who had spent her entire life holding a wall up and now had nothing left to keep it standing. When Carla left, I watched my mom's shoulders shake. For a moment, I almost wanted to comfort her, but the memory of every whispered, "It's the stairs," pressed against my ribs harder than any broken bone. She'd chosen silence, and silence had consequences. As evening fell, the room dimmed with the fading light outside. A nurse switched on the small lamp near my bed. The glow painted soft lines across the walls. My ribs ached. My body felt hollowed out by everything that had happened, but my chest wasn't tight in the same way anymore. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like my house controlled me. Daniel was behind bars. The entire neighborhood knew the truth. My name might not have been in the article, but my story was. It was written in headlines, spoken through microphones printed in black ink. He couldn't bury it again. No one could. I reached for the newspaper still folded beside me and looked at that headline once more. My fingerprints smudged the ink. It wasn't just a story about him. It was a story about how silence ends, how walls crack, how secrets burn when light finally hits them. The truth had blown everything open, and even though I was scared, bruised, and broken, I was standing in the middle of that storm, alive. Have you ever seen the truth blow everything open like this? Share your city in the comments. A week after the arrest, a nurse brought in a plain white envelope with my name written on it in blocky, familiar handwriting. My stomach went cold the second I saw it. Daniel's letters always had that stiff, heavy look, as if each word was carved with a knife. It came through the jail's outgoing mail. The officer who delivered it told me it had been screened already, then left it on the rolling tray beside my bed. The room was quiet except for the hum of the monitor by my head. Mom was sitting in the chair again, pale, and wrung out a sweater draped around her like a shield. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper folded twice. His handwriting was careful, almost neat, as if that would make the words matter more. "Harper, I love you. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." He didn't apologize. He didn't admit anything. He didn't say he was sorry for the bruises or the broken ribs or the nights I couldn't breathe. It was the same voice he'd used when he told neighbors I was clumsy. The same tone that had smoothed over everything for years. I could hear it between the lines, the certainty that I would keep his secret. My hands trembled slightly, but my face stayed cold. I felt the air in the room tighten around me, not from fear this time, but from the sheer audacity of him trying to twist the world back into shape. Mom saw the letter too. She didn't ask to read it. She didn't have to. She knew. Her hand flew to her mouth and a soft sound broke out of her chest. She started to cry quietly, shoulders shaking, her breath hitching against the fabric of her sweater. I folded the paper once more, slow and deliberate, and set it back on the tray like something dirty. His words didn't pull me under. They didn't even reach me. A week ago they might have. A month ago they would have owned me. But now his name was printed in newspapers, his face broadcast on the news. My ribs still ached with every breath, but the silence he'd built around us was gone. Mom whispered through her tears, "I can't undo what I let happen." She was looking at me like someone begging for forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. Her voice cracked in the middle, thin and desperate. For a moment, I saw her not as the woman who stood silent in doorways, but as someone who'd built her own cage and locked herself in. But the part of me that used to reach for her was gone. I had been reaching for years. She had turned away every time. I looked at her and said, "You won't have to. I'll do it." The words came out flat steady like a promise. She flinched like I had hit her, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I wasn't talking about saving him or her. I was talking about finishing what started that night in the hospital. He had spent years using my silence. He wouldn't use it again. Mom covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. She had been the one standing at the top of the basement stairs whispering, "It's the stairs, Harper." Those words had wrapped around me like a chokehold for too long. I turned my gaze back to the letter. His handwriting was so familiar it made my skin crawl. He thought this was still his story. He thought if he whispered enough lies, I'd fold again like I always had. But the walls had cracked. The light was in. His voice didn't matter anymore. I pushed the letter back across the tray toward the officer who returned to check on me later that afternoon. "You can keep it," I said. He nodded and slipped it into an evidence bag. Daniel's attempt to claw his way back in was just another piece of proof, now nothing more. That night, the hospital window reflected my face against the parking lot lights. The bruises were still there. The ribs were still cracked. But there was something else in my eyes I hadn't seen before. Distance. Not fear. Not loyalty. Just distance. Daniel was behind walls he couldn't walk through, and his words, once so heavy, had finally lost their weight. September arrived warm and dry, the kind of Kentucky September that clings to summer just a little too long. The courthouse in Fayette County stood against the sky, solid and gray, its steps worn smooth by years of people walking toward verdicts they couldn't escape. My heart thudded against my ribs as I walked through the security checkpoint with Ms. Martinez at my side. I could feel the weight of every breath against the healing bones under my sweater. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, like every story ever told in here had left something behind. The benches were filled with quiet faces. Some from the neighborhood, some from the press, a few I recognized from school. I kept my head high, even though my hands were damp. Daniel sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit him anymore. It hung wrong on his shoulders. His hair was neater than I'd ever seen it, his expression carefully blank. For a second, it almost startled me how ordinary he looked. No boots, no basement, no shadows, just a man. But the ache in my ribs reminded me exactly who he was. The judge entered, and the room rose. My stomach flipped as I saw the jury. 12 strangers, each carrying the weight of a decision that had already been written in my bones. The prosecution opened with the evidence. They didn't dress it up with pretty words. They put the x-rays on the screen one after another. The room dimmed slightly as the projector hummed. My rib cage glowed white against black. There were the clean lines of the new break. There were the faint-healed fractures stacked beneath. The prosecutor traced them with a red pointer, explaining how each line told a story of repeated trauma. The jury leaned forward, their eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in something closer to stunned disbelief. A nurse testified first. Kelly. Her voice was calm and steady. She described the bruises she'd seen, the shape of the marks, the moment she knew the story of the stairs was a lie. She told the court how I'd flinched when she touched my side, how I looked at the floor when my mother spoke for me. She didn't need to embellish. The truth carried its own weight. Then came the doctor. He explained the age of the injuries. 7 fractures in various stages of healing. He pointed to the patterns that didn't line up with accidental falls. Every word built a wall of fact, brick by brick. Daniel sat there with his hands folded, looking at the floor like a man rehearsing remorse. His lawyer tried to poke holes in the testimony, but the holes closed before they even opened. "You can't argue with bones." When it was my turn to testify, the bailiff led me to the witness stand. My palms were slick, my throat dry, but my voice was steadier than I expected. The judge swore me in. I looked out over the courtroom at the faces that had once been background noise to my pain. The neighbors who had brought casseroles and never asked questions, the classmates who looked away in hallways. And then, Daniel. I met his eyes for half a heartbeat, long enough to see the flicker behind the mask. Not power, not control. Fear. It wasn't big, but it was real. My voice shook on the first sentence, but after that it didn't. I told them about the night with the water glass, about the basement, about the sound of my ribs breaking, about the way my mother whispered lies into the air like prayers. I told them about the silence that grew like mold in the walls of our house, the way he measured out control in footsteps and rules. I didn't cry. The tears had already burned out months ago. The prosecutor let me speak without interruption. When I finished, I felt like I had set something down that I'd been carrying for 6 years. His lawyer stood up to cross-examine. He tried to make it sound like misunderstandings, like I might have fallen, like maybe I was clumsy. I looked him straight in the eye and said I didn't fall. He hit me. I heard the rib crack. I saw Daniel's face that night, and I saw it now. His jaw tightening, a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. The mask was slipping. The jury saw it too. The defense called no one else to the stand. Daniel didn't take the stand himself. His lawyer mumbled about misunderstandings, about a difficult family life, about discipline gone too far. The words fell flat against the x-rays glowing on the screen like a silent witness that couldn't be intimidated. It took the jury less than 3 hours. 3 hours to undo 6 years. The judge called the court back to order. The 4-person stood and the words came out clean and final. Guilty on all counts. I heard a soft sound behind me, someone gasping, maybe my mom. She sat on the bench, clutching her hands together like she was trying to keep from falling apart. Daniel didn't look at me when the verdict was read. He stared at the table, his knuckles white against the wood. When the judge spoke again, the air shifted. 25 years. No early parole. The words landed in the room like a door slamming shut. The judge's voice was calm, formal, but underneath it, I heard the weight of the evidence. The pattern of injuries. The silence. The choices. Daniel would not walk back into that house. Not into any house. He would spend the next 25 years inside walls that didn't answer to him. When they stood to take him away, he finally looked at me. It wasn't the look he used to give me in the hallway, the one that made my chest tighten. It was something smaller, a man realizing the world he built on fear had collapsed around him. I didn't look away. The bailiff let him out in cuffs. The sound of the chains was soft, but it echoed in my chest louder than any of his footsteps ever had. After the courtroom cleared, the prosecutor approached me and Ms. Martinez. He shook my hand. "You did good," he said, not because I'd been perfect, but because I'd spoken. Mom approached me slowly. Her eyes were swollen, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I can't undo what I did, or what I didn't do." I stood there, the courtroom emptying around us, and said nothing at first. There were no words that could pull us back to what we were before. She would face her own consequences. The civil charges against her were still pending for failure to protect. But more than that, she would live with the silence she'd chosen. She reached for me, but I stepped back slightly, not out of hate, out of truth. We were two people standing in the wreckage of a house built on lies. The legal part was done. The sentence had been spoken, but the real weight was everything that came after. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing like they wanted to capture the exact moment justice became a headline. I walked down those steps slowly, feeling the sun on my face, warm and strange after so many months of fluorescent light. People whispered, some nodded, some avoided my eyes. I didn't care. The cage was gone. The man who built it was behind bars. My voice had been heard where it mattered. I turned my face toward the street, the breeze catching my hair, and breathed deep into lungs that still ached but no longer felt trapped. It wasn't a happy ending. There's no such thing in stories like mine, but it was real. It was justice. And for the first time, it was enough. I moved out of Lexington on a quiet morning in early October. The air had that crisp edge that only comes when summer finally lets go. Aunt Heather drove the old truck she'd inherited from my grandfather. The bed was stacked with boxes that didn't contain much. Just a few clothes, my favorite worn hoodie, a small stack of books and the X-ray film the hospital had printed for me when the trial ended. I'd asked for it, not because I wanted to keep the pain, but because I wanted to remember that the truth had once been carved into my bones and set me free. The drive to her town took a little over 2 hours, most of it through long stretches of farmland and trees painted gold and rust. I watched the fields roll by through the window, the hum of the tires on the highway, steady like a heartbeat I didn't have to fear. It felt strange to be leaving Lexington to know the house I'd grown up in wasn't mine anymore and never would be again. I didn't look back. Aunt Heather lived in a small town that smelled like fresh rain and wood smoke. Her house sat at the end of a long, gravel driveway, a single-story home with a front porch and a wind chime that caught the light. She hugged me the second I stepped out of the truck. Not the careful, trembling way my mom used to touch me, but a real hug that felt like solid ground. "You're safe here, Harper," she whispered, and for the first time, I almost believed it. The first few weeks weren't easy. My body still hurt. My ribs healed slowly, every deep breath reminding me of what they'd survived. Nights were worse. The silence in Aunt Heather's house was different from the silence in Lexington. It didn't press down on me. It just existed. But my brain didn't know how to live inside. Quiet that wasn't dangerous. Sometimes I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, waiting for boots on the stairs, for a voice in the doorway, for something that no longer existed. Therapy started the second week I was there. Heather drove me to a small counseling center downtown. The therapist, Dr. Mason, had soft eyes and a calm voice that didn't demand anything from me. At first, I didn't talk much. Words felt too heavy. But she didn't push. She sat across from me with her notepad resting on her knee and waited. Session after session, I started to speak. I talked about the stairs, about the basement, about the sound of ribs breaking, about how silence had become a language I never chose to learn. She didn't try to fix it. She just helped me pick apart the knots piece by piece until the air around me didn't feel as sharp. School was a different kind of battlefield. Starting junior year in a new town where no one knew my name felt like walking into a world that hadn't already decided what I was. People looked at me and saw a quiet girl in a hoodie, not the bruised shadow of someone else's story. No one whispered about Daniel in the hallways here. No one lowered their voices when I walked past. I wasn't sure who to be without the weight of his presence pressing against me, so I learned slowly. I joined art club because it didn't require words. I started sitting with a group of girls at lunch who talked about movies and homework and weekend plans like the world was a safe place. At first, I barely said anything, but one day I laughed at a joke and they didn't look at me like I was broken. They just kept talking. It felt small, but it mattered. The house in Lexington was sold at auction a few weeks after the sentencing. The county seized most of Daniel's belongings as part of the judgment against him. Mom moved into a small apartment closer to her job, but I didn't see her much. She was facing her own legal consequences for what she'd allowed to happen. We spoke on the phone once after the house was cleared out. Her voice was thin, unsure. She said she was in therapy too. I wanted to believe her. I told her I wasn't ready to see her. She said she understood. I think for once, she actually did. Heather's house didn't have any locked doors. It took me a long time to realize that. At night, I'd catch myself checking the front door over and over, waiting for the sound of a truck in the driveway. It never came. The only sounds were the wind chime on the porch and the soft rustle of leaves outside my window. I learned how to breathe differently here. Not fast and shallow, but slow, deep, without flinching. Dr. Mason gave me exercises to ground myself when old fears tried to crawl back in. I kept a small, smooth stone in my pocket to hold when my heartbeat got too loud. She said healing wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about learning to exist alongside it without letting it own me. Sometimes after school, I'd walk to the small park near Heather's house. It wasn't anything special, just a few trees, a couple of benches, a pond where ducks gathered, but it was mine. I'd sit there with a sketchbook and draw until the sun dipped low and the air turned cool. The world didn't feel entirely safe, but it was big again, and it belonged to me in pieces. People in town started to know my name not as a headline, but as a person. Harper. The girl who liked to draw by the pond. The girl who was quiet but smiled when someone waved. I wasn't just a survivor. I was becoming someone else. Someone who could stand on their own. In December, I testified again briefly for a civil hearing involving my mom. It wasn't as brutal as the criminal trial. She took responsibility, admitted what she had done, and failed to do. I watched her from the stand, saw the weight in her shoulders, and for the first time, I felt something close to pity. She had been trapped too, but unlike me, she had chosen to stay. The court ordered restitution. She would pay damages to the victim, me, for her failure to act. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Christmas came with quiet warmth. Heather baked pies and hung lights across the porch. We watched old movies with mugs of hot cocoa in our hands. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at sudden noises. I didn't wait for a voice in the doorway. On New Year's Eve, Heather handed me a small box. Inside was a silver necklace with a tiny charm shaped like a feather. She said it was to remind me of how far I'd come. I wore it under my hoodie and touched it whenever the world felt too heavy. In January, I started volunteering at the same counseling center where I saw Dr. Mason. Just small things, helping at the front desk, organizing art supplies for group sessions, but it mattered. I watched other kids walk through those doors, some with the same look in their eyes I used to have. I didn't have all the answers for them, but I understood the weight they carried. That was enough. One afternoon, Dr. Mason asked if I wanted to share my story at a training session for medical staff. She said what happened to me had changed the way the hospital responded to signs of abuse. I thought about Nurse Kelly's face, about the way she said, "These aren't from stairs, sweetheart." I said yes. Standing at that podium weeks later, my voice shook at first, but it didn't break. I told them what it felt like to have your truth trapped inside your body and how one person seeing you could change everything. They listened. I saw it in their faces. They heard me. By the time spring came, the nightmares weren't gone, but they didn't own me. I still woke up some nights with my heart hammering in my chest, convinced I heard footsteps that weren't there. But I could sit up, breathe, and remind myself I wasn't in that house anymore. I had a lock on my bedroom door that I never needed to use. I had people who said my name like it belonged to me. I wasn't a secret. I wasn't an apology. I was Harper Lane, 17 years old, breathing fully for the first time in a long time. The day the county officially transferred ownership of the house in Lexington to a new family, I stood on Heather's porch and watched the wind move the chimes. It was strange to think that another girl might sleep in my old room, that someone else might sit on the same porch steps. But the house didn't own me anymore. It never would again. Life didn't turn perfect overnight. Healing isn't soft or easy. But it was mine. One day at a time, I was building something new, not on lies or silence, but on the sound of my own breath steady in my chest. That was enough. That was everything. Machines don't lie. People do. I didn't understand how powerful that sentence was until the day the X-rays were put up on the screen in that courtroom. Bones don't care about secrets. They don't care about lies whispered in dark basements or polite smiles at neighborhood barbecues. Bones tell the truth, whether you want them to or not. When I look at the film hanging on the wall of my new room, the one with those faint, ghostly lines where my ribs broke and healed, I don't see weakness. I don't see a girl who was too quiet to speak. I see evidence. I see survival carved into calcium and shadow. People can look you in the eye and pretend nothing is happening. They can turn their backs, build entire lives out of pretending your pain doesn't exist. But the truth is patient. It waits in the cracks and the bruises, in the spaces where silence tries to smother it. And when it finally steps into the light, it does not whisper. It roars. My room at Aunt Heather's house is small, but it's mine. On one wall, there's a corkboard filled with sketches I've made since moving here. A pond at sunset, a field of corn catching the wind, a portrait of Heather laughing. And in the center, framed in simple wood, hangs that X-ray. It's not there because I want to remember the pain. It's there because I want to remember the moment pain stopped being my secret and became the reason someone listened. When I wake up in the morning, sunlight hits that frame first. It cuts across the glass, soft and golden, the way it used to never touch my face in Lexington. It's strange how something so cold and clinical became a reminder of warmth. I used to believe silence was safer than truth. Daniel taught me that. He taught me to keep my voice buried, to shrink into walls, to build myself into a ghost in my own home. But that was a lie, and it almost became the last thing I ever believed. Silence isn't safety. It's just the space where someone else's power grows. I think about Nurse Kelly sometimes. How she looked at me not like a problem, not like a burden, but like a person worth seeing. I think about the detective who sat across from me and didn't look away when I spoke. I think about Heather who opened a door that wasn't locked. They didn't save me. They saw me. And I stepped out because of it. Healing isn't a straight line. Some days the air still gets stuck in my chest. Some nights the darkness still feels like the basement. But I've learned that fear doesn't get to be the only voice in my head anymore. I've learned to breathe through it. I've learned to speak anyway. When people hear my story, they ask how I kept going. The truth is, I didn't always. There were nights when I counted the cracks in the ceiling because it was easier than counting the bruises. There were mornings when I told myself to disappear quietly because that seemed simpler than surviving loudly. But something in me, small and stubborn, refused to stay buried. And when the X-rays came, when the world finally had to look, that small part of me grew louder. The truth doesn't always arrive in sirens and headlines. Sometimes it arrives in silence, the snap of a rib, the glow of a film on a light board, the trembling hand of a girl who decides she's done carrying everyone else's secrets. When the trial ended, people told me I was brave. I don't know if that's the word I'd use. Brave sounds like a choice. Most days I didn't feel like I had one, but I showed up anyway. I told the truth. I watched the man who tried to make me disappear face something bigger than his control. And maybe that's what bravery really is, not some loud, shining thing, but quiet persistence. I don't know who will hear this. Maybe it's someone who's living inside a house like the one I grew up in. Maybe it's someone who's learned to walk on eggshells so quietly they don't even notice the sound anymore. Maybe it's someone who hasn't said it out loud yet. If that's you, I need you to hear this. You are not the bruise someone left on your body. You are not the silence someone shoved down your throat. You are the heartbeat that kept going anyway. You are the breath that still fills your lungs. And the truth, your truth, deserves to be seen. Machines don't lie. People do. But the truth finds a way through. It always does. One day it will find you too. And when it does, the world that tried to keep you quiet will have to listen. I trace my fingers along the edge of the X-ray frame, sometimes feeling the smooth wood beneath my skin. It's not a wound anymore. It's a scar that speaks louder than any lie Daniel ever told. It's proof that I lived. It's proof that I'm still here. Outside my window, the first light of morning spills across the floor, soft and golden. It lands on the walls, the sketches, the X-ray my hands. This light doesn't hide. It doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives. It's freedom in its simplest form. If you've ever survived something you couldn't talk about, comment "I survived." You're not alone. Somewhere out there, someone is holding their breath, waiting for the truth to find them. And when it does, I hope they see the sunrise too.